Hello, welcome to the third installment of the fDi podcast. I'm Courtney Fingar, editor-in-chief of fDi magazine. I'm joined with my colleague Natasha Turok, global markets reporter for fDi.
Hi there.
Natasha and I were both last month at MIPIM, the international real estate fair that attracts nearly 25,000 people. And apart from being an interesting and lively conference, it's usually a pretty good way to read the market and to find out what's concerning people, what's the mood out there, and also to get a sense of what we can expect for the rest of the year. There's large representation, especially from around Europe at the conference, and there are mayors from dozens of European cities amongst other leaders there, as well as corporate executives and corporate occupiers. What I noticed this year was a feeling of nervousness among attendees. It seems there's a lot of uncertainty, almost bordering on anxiety, and a lot of pessimism out there, with some pockets here and there of cautious optimism. Seems that politics are really dominating the markets right now and causing some uncertainty and a lot of speculation, of course, about the Trump presidency and what it means for the world. Although on that front, a lot of corporate occupiers told us they're taking a wait-and-see approach. But it seems in Europe, the geopolitical challenges of the moment have rattled a few nerves. Natasha, what was the feeling that you felt out there?
I mean, I'd definitely say it was night and day compared to the MIPIM conference of 2016. I don't think anyone who was there a year ago would have predicted where exactly we would all be today. It was almost happy-go-lucky a year ago, but now with the overwhelming support for populism that we haven't seen in decades, sweeping developed markets as well as continued incidences of terrorism, indeed everyone seemed pretty nervous. I mean, there are still like deep pockets, and investors with loads of money to spend, but there seems to be an eye rather on things like portfolio investments than greenfield, even though IPAs are trying really hard to attract this. It's just the mood is very tense, I would say, compared to the past.
Yes, and I think there is this wait-and-see approach of investors, not just in relation to the U.S. and fDi because of the uncertainty of Trump, but because greenfield investments are really long-term investments and they're not so easily unwound as portfolio or speculative types of investment. You really have to be sure and feel the security in order to make these kinds of investments. So I think there is some reticence out there. And in this difficult time, investment promotion agencies, they do have their hands full, really trying to keep a positive message and trying to keep investment flowing in with investors feeling so apprehensive. Among the delegates there was Bastian Skaller, CEO of the World Association of Investment Promotion Agencies, or Waipa. And I asked him what worries member agencies in Waipa about the current moment and how that's impacting investment.
They have some kind of fears because of the geopolitical changes, and especially this terrorism which is going on all around, and they do not know what to do. They are aware that there is a lot of money around. The investors have money, but they are keeping it because they are not sure of if the markets are stable. They are telling us that there are still mostly portfolio investments and let's say financial into the services, let's say investments to services. But they would all like to attract more greenfield. Of course, it's normal. But for this, the investors need a bit more trust.
Yes, indeed. As Mr. Skaller mentions, it's because of the longer-term, almost more permanent nature of greenfield investment that it is sensible for companies to really hold back unless they really know where that location is headed and what kind of political environment will await them in the future. Now, of course, because of the heavy European representation, there was inevitable talk about European politics, which are, of course, fraught with uncertainty at the moment, not just about Brexit, but also upcoming elections on the continent that have a lot of observers watching, waiting, wondering, and feeling a bit nervous. Now, Natasha spoke with Walter Becher, who's Director of Research and Forecasting at property firm Colliers, and he talked a little bit about the risks the European market is facing.
I think one of the biggest risks we got is EU fragmentation, not least of which because as a bloc, the EU is big enough and powerful enough to counterbalance, the American bloc, as it were. And of course, the Chinese are the new bloc rising in the West, and so, I could see that EU fragmentation could lead to quite a lot of disturbance, generally speaking. it also has implications for capital flows.
Yes, the risk of the EU breaking up or being destabilized in any way is one reason all eyes are on France at the moment, with its elections coming up, with the first round due to take place in late April and the runoff in May. And mainstream political leaders across Europe, many of whom are still reeling from the UK's vote to leave the EU, are watching nervously. I spoke with Dario Nardella, the mayor of the Italian city of Florence, about what's keeping him up at night in relation to European politics. And he told me about his concerns and says he sees it all as a bigger battle between pro-European and anti-European movements. And really, the stakes couldn't possibly be higher. Let's hear him.
We have to win in France and in Germany, and I mean the democratic and European parties. In this moment, we have in Europe a big competition between European democratic political subjects and anti-Europeans and nationalist and populist parties. The question is not yet right and left. The question is democratic European forces and anti-European nationalist and populist forces.
Indeed, Courtney, the mayor's words are very sobering for a lot of investors across Europe and across the world, really. This is a very real risk. I mean, this year's election is fundamental simply for the scope of change it may trigger. It represents the first time an anti-EU candidate, Marine Le Pen of the National Front, stands a very realistic chance of winning. And for anyone who isn't caught up, current polls show the far-right candidate, Ms. Le Pen, neck and neck with former investment banker Emmanuel Macron, who's a fairly untested candidate of the social liberal party called En Marche. And these are the two in the lead. And Macron he's pro-deregulation, he's economically conservative, and supports cutting the public sector to the tune of about 120,000 public sector jobs. Now, formerly an investment banker at Rothschilds, Mr. Macron has benefited greatly from the status quo, while the status quo is exactly what spawned this unpredictable turn toward populism in the first place across so many developed markets. Meanwhile, Ms. Le Pen has vowed to hold a referendum to leave the EU, and her agenda also promises anti-immigrant and anti-globalization policies. So while at MIPIM I wanted to sort of gauge the environment, gauge the sort of attitude of French mayors across a variety of cities and what they felt was at stake in this election for them. And what was interesting, Courtney, was that I didn't manage to find a consensus at all. Some of the mayors were quite sunny and quite unconcerned. They were pretty confident in the status quo would remain. For example, like the mayor of Lyon, France's second biggest city, Gérard Collomb. And here's what he had to say.
Moi, je ne suis pas inquiet.
Well, I'm not concerned at all.
Parce que je suis un garçon optimiste.
Because I'm a very optimistic guy.
Et donc, je pense que les choses vont bien se passer.
And I think things are going to go perfectly well.
Donc, il n'y aura pas de choc avec l'élection de Madame Le Pen présidentielle.
Problem with Madame Le Pen being elected.
Of course, the mayor went on to say that the reason he didn't see a problem with Le Pen getting elected is because he doesn't think she'll get elected, not that it wouldn't be a problem if she were. So he was taking very much an optimist view about the risk of a populist in office. And he also said the economy is doing better than last year and that the European economy seems to have picked up based on the active presence of big European cities who were showing a bit more life at MIPIM. But as Natasha, you mentioned, not everybody was so optimistic, were they? What was the reaction from some other French city leaders that you spoke with?
Well, indeed, like you said, the mayor of Lyon's reaction sort of, I couldn't help but be reminded of the attitude of many, many people across the United States in the lead up to the American elections when Donald Trump had his upset win. But I spoke to the vice mayor of Dijon, Denis Hameau. Dijon is the capital of France's Burgundy region. And what he said, and I'll say it in English, although he said it in French, was, quote, I asked him if commerce and investment are vulnerable to a Le Pen victory, and he said yes, because you are facing two different conceptions of the economy and globalization. He said, we have a protectionist mentality that we're facing in which we raise tariffs everywhere. Our exports and trade become less free. It will have consequences, especially for those who work in exporting. So yes, there is a worry. I then spoke to the mayor of Bordeaux, Alain Juppé, who is a former prime minister of France, and he absolutely did not hold back when he spoke about this issue. So he said, quote, "Protectionism is a detestable idea. Anything that can obstruct the liberty of movement of goods and people across Europe is a real issue. I'm worried in the context of Brexit that a consensus is developing, a historic choice." He continued by saying, quote, "On the other hand, I do not want to linger on it because I'm absolutely convinced that we must do everything to avoid the dislocation of Europe. The danger is great. It is more urgent than ever to restart the idea of the EU. I would simply say that the worst is not certain." So on those rather ominous words, it was really interesting because there just seemed to be a variety of, in terms of the levels of concern approaching this election. And coming back to Walter Betcher from Colliers, he stressed, of course, that any drastic change will be bad for investors. Here's what he had to say.
Fillon would have been best for property just by virtue of the sense that a certain discipline would be maintained in France and that the investment environment would be perhaps a bit more stable. I think anybody else coming in, including Le Pen, has the potential to destabilize that hugely. And Le Pen specifically, because she's anti-EU and wants to come out of the euro, suddenly raises the whole issue of all the instability that would come out of trying to, or raising a question mark over continued participation in either the EU or being a member of the euro.
So Natasha is going to be watching these elections closely and reporting on them for us. And I guess the result's going to tell us a lot about not just the future of France, but the continent of Europe.
Yeah, and in the case of a Le Pen victory, and I only focus on this because it would represent the most drastic change from the status quo. In the event of a Le Pen victory, markets should embrace for immediate moves by the president to convene an emergency European Council to renegotiate France's EU membership, dismiss the central bank governor, and in an extreme scenario, use the state of emergency to assume extraordinary powers over the army and police if mass protests follow her election. And those are that's from some analysis from political risk consultancy Eurasia Group. The latest national opinion polls have Le Pen and Macron neck and neck, with Macron at 24% and Le Pen at 23%. Republican candidate François Fillon and leftist Jean-Luc Mélenchon are tied at 19%. The first round of the French elections are April 23rd, and a runoff will be held on May 7th.
Well, we'll have to wait and see what happens. And of course, we'll be covering it for our readers. You can follow the analysis and what it all means for FDI on www.fdiintelligence.com, as well as the print edition of the magazine. Natasha, thanks for sharing your views, and thank you all for tuning in. Goodbye.